Start. And I would like to start by welcoming everybody here for joining us on what is a beautiful day here on the East Coast and apparently also in Toronto and on the West Coast, joining us for this event. I've been really looking forward to. I wanted to quickly introduce the Global Asia Initiative here at Rutgers, which we have been working on for a number of years. This past year in particular, we've been extremely active. We were going through it about 8 events over the course of this past year, some of which have been research briefings, which have been collaborations among various of our colleagues, talking to each other and trying to find commonalities across campuses at Rutgers. But we've also had a number of really exciting external events with invited speakers. Earlier in the fall, some of you'll remember, we had a kind of conversation and a screening of 1,000 Cuts. So we've done, it's kind of fitting in a way that we're framing our season of events with 2 events that center on media and cultural flows. So without too much further ado, I just wanted to welcome you all to our event tonight. Thank you all for joining us, and hand it over to Allan to talk a little bit more about tonight's event, which is entitled Boy Love Cultures and Inter-Asia Media Flows. So why don't you go ahead and take over from here?
Thank you so much, Tamara. I'm Allan Isaac. I'm co-director with Tamara Sears with the Global Asia's Initiative. And this is a wonderful day and way to start the spring. And it is a beautiful day, and we're going to talk about boy love this spring, as it's pink with cherry blossoms in Central Park right outside. But also we are, in fact, doing this alongside with April and also Apida Heritage Month. So welcome and thank you to all of you to share your time with us this afternoon. And also thank you to our guests, and I'll introduce one in each turn. And then also, but I want to welcome all the fans of BL series, web series, TV shows, all the shippers out there. They know who they are because I've spoken to a couple of them in my class that they've discovered it during, just like me, during COVID summer. And for myself, I was actually watching Together because somebody in Manila had told me that I should be watching Together, which is this Thai production, BL production. And then, of course, I found out a little later that summer there was something called Game Boys that was from Manila. That was also about a boy love, but it's about, and everything was, of course, was COVID, so their romance was actually going through just like in Zoom. Just like here, the web series was actually in little boxes. And then, of course, I recalled because Robert Diaz reminded me of this film in the 90s. I think it was Love in Siam, which, of course, I absolutely broke my heart. I remember that I did see it some years ago, and I realized this is much older than just last summer. This was more than a fling, a summer fling. It has been going on for quite a while. So thank you to welcome to all of you, and I want to introduce the 3 speakers right now, and then in the order that they'll be speaking. So first is Professor Michelle Cho, University of Toronto, from the East Asian Studies Department. Professor Cho's research and teaching focus on questions of collectivity and popular aesthetics in Korean film, media, and popular culture. Her book, Genre Worlds, Global Forms, and Millennial South Korean Cinema, theorizes South Korean cinema's transnational dimensions through the concept of genre transference. Her current work theorizes the convergence of platforms, affect, and globalization fantasies in Korean wave content and fandoms. And then next, we'll hear from Professor Dredge Kang-Nguyen from UC San Diego Anthropology. Professor Kang-Nguyen's research focuses on beauty and love as they intersect with race, class, gender, sexuality, globalization, and structural violence in body modification and interracial relationships. Dr. Kang-Nguyen teaches courses on love, beauty, race, gender variance, sex work, sexual health, global health, inter-Asian and transnational Southeast Asian studies, and the Korean wave. And third, Professor Robert G. Diaz, also from the University of Toronto, Women's and Gender Studies Institute. Professor Diaz's research focuses on the experience of sexual minorities in Asia, with particular attention to diaspora communities in the Trans-Pacific Southeast Asia and the Philippines. He examines transnational representations of sexual minority Filipinos in contemporary new media, film, and popular culture. And without further ado, let me give it over to Professor Michelle Cho. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm grateful to all of you who are here joining us on a beautiful afternoon. I wanted to thank Allan for organizing, and Allan, Tamara for the work that they've done to put this event together, and also to my co-panelists, Robert and Dredge. I think this is going to be a really fun conversation. I'm going to just set myself up so that I can keep an eye on time, and also I'm going to start a PowerPoint presentation. I do have some images to share with you. So here we are. Sorry, hang on. I've been doing this all year for teaching, but I guess you wouldn't know it from yeah, my clumsiness, or maybe my computer is, I have to admit, my computer is spazzing a little bit, but I think it'll get through it.
I can also pop in. Oh, okay, got it. Okay.
Yes, I think we're good. Oh no, sorry, this is the wrong file. There we go. Oh, just a second. My apologies.
No trouble.
Okay, thank you for your patience. Okay, here we go. There we are. So what I wanted to do today is actually kind of present a little bit of the more established scholarship on boys love cultures as they have been kind of situated in East Asian studies, and then talk a bit about why I think it's so important that conversations like today's are happening, where we're bringing in a concerted kind of focus on transmedia and transnational flows, especially to cut across the very arbitrary and rather artificial distinctions that we make in academic spaces between East Asian and Southeast Asian regions and cultures. And I think that, you know, conversations such as ours will happen more, I think, in the future as we go along. But I think that bringing a discussion of BL outside of East Asian studies is very, very helpful. But that being said, I am kind of taking us back in some ways to the national framing, because that is how BL has been discussed so far. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the way that BL reception has really been discussed often through national frames. And there's also a kind of discussion of a genealogy of BL, what this culture kind of represents from where it originates. So these are just images of two recent books. Actually, this Hanjung book is now 10 years old or a little over that. So it used to be recent. When I first read it, it was recent, but maybe a little less so now. But these are texts that are looking at transformations in commodified masculinities and how they are circulating through South Korean popular culture. Chungmin Kwon's text, and she's a communication studies scholar, actually focuses on the South Korean context specifically, and looking at the way that BL texts or pop culture texts that feature kind of gay romance, but one that is often quite removed from gay life in South Korea, has specifically been marketed towards mostly straight women for a very long time. And that is really the story of how BL is established, and the way that the genre kind of solidifies or condenses in certain ways, and then the way that that gets transported across the region. So I'm going to talk about that a little more in a second. I just wanted to also point to a couple of other texts that are looking at BL, and they are again using a kind of linguistic frame in this case. So the Boys Love Manga and Beyond anthology here is an important text that really brings a lot of historical context about the Japanese cultural sphere that gives rise to this kind of image, these images or the iconography of BL. But it is, again, sort of nation state focused. And then in the case of Boys Love cosplay and androgynous idols, queer fan cultures in mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, you have a kind of sinophone sphere lens used to look at BL and the fan cultures and fan practices that arise from it. And this book is really looking at the fandom dimensions, but again, is really kind of thinking about, the way that BL as a genre of girls culture kind of shifts across manga or manhwa, comic books, to television, to anime, and to pop idol culture. So these are all kind of related spaces, but are constructing together a kind of transmedia space. So in the Japan-specific kind of narrative, BL comes from girls' comics. So shoujo manga in Korean, this is called sunjang manhwa. So this kind of 1970s moment is very important for originating these beautiful kind of love stories and the beautiful boys, the bishonen, that are typical of BL culture. I just kind of grabbed this image from a webpage that was looking at vintage 1970s manga, because you can see very clearly the kind of similarity in the way that the figures are rendered. So there is a strong emphasis on androgyny in this kind of imagery. And I think that that gets associated with youth, which gets associated with a kind of space, a fantasy space of non-differentiation, perhaps, between men and women, male, female, or girls and boys. And that is part of the originating fantasy that this kind of beautiful boy, BL, boys love genre is constructing for in texts that are, again, marketed to younger or young women. So I want to talk a little bit about a kind of earlier phase of transmedia circulation in a regional context of this idea of girls' culture and how it uses the figure of young, beautiful men as a way to, again, cater a fantasy to these young women readers or viewers. So this is an image from Hana Yori Dango, which is a famous manga serial that was adapted in multiple times across the televisual space of East Asia. So its first television adaptation is Meteor Garden, which is a Taiwanese drama. Then there's a Korean drama, Boys Over Flowers, which for a lot of people is a kind of gateway drama that got them into K-dramas as a genre of television. Although maybe I'm talking to like slightly older people at this point, but the term like flower gets attached to the term for beautiful man, minam, got minam. So got is flower and minam is beautiful man. So that becomes itself a kind of type. A beautiful boy is really what it refers to. And so the got minam type is then what you see represented over and over in K-pop idol culture and also in BL storytelling. I wanted to just emphasize that there is a kind of direct connection to the pop landscape, even with this sort of early wave in Hana Yori Dango being adapted into a Taiwanese television show, and then a boy band kind of is generated from that show, and then actually becomes quite successful on their own as a idol group. And then with the Korean adaptation 2009, the F4 they are not necessarily musicians, but they're just kind of reimagined as like a crew of pretty boys or gomminam. And so that idea of like many flower boys together, that I think becomes a sort of staple of this 2000s era representation. So you see this same formula being used in many television shows from the period. So this show is called Mina Mishineo, which is like a very kind of polite way of saying you are a beautiful man, you are the Minam, the Bishonen. But it actually features a trope of misrecognition that becomes very common in shows of this type around this time. And so this character here is a girl, but her androgynous appearance is what allows her entry into the homosocial space that's represented by this group of pretty men. And so there's really an emphasis on androgyny here as a kind of enabling performance for straight women or heterosexual women who actually are using that androgynous performance in order to expand their horizons in terms of both friendship and work. So so again, this is the kind of array of gomminam, and it's interesting to kind of think about this figure of the tomboy or the androgynous girl as a gomminam or flower boy, because that's really how she's being presented. This is a screenshot from a film called The King and the Clown, which was released in 2005. And it was a huge kind of box office hit in South Korea that year. And it kind of brought to the attention of film producers and media industry professionals that there was a huge audience for this kind of fantasized same-sex romance, because the central couple in this film are these two performers. They are clowns or kind of itinerant performers during the Joseon period, the pre-modern era. And this role really kind of launched the career of this actor right here, Lee Jung-gi, who is pictured as the kind of quintessential beautiful boy in this film. And so he is just an object of fascination for everybody he encounters. I'm sorry, but my cat is getting involved here. Sorry. What? Okay. And so then, of course, the flower boy is a staple now in K-pop idol culture. And so, you know, a lot of the time in fan engagements that K-pop idols, they do a lot of autograph signings or fan meetings and that sort of thing. And this flower crown is actually, you know, really common. It'll appear in some way at some of these events as a kind of gesture of fan service to the fans who are looking for their pop idols to embody this figure of the flower boy. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to just talk a little bit about a specific text that I think is really exemplary of the way that androgyny is working in this earlier kind of transmedia assemblage of texts from the early 2000s, which I think will help us to understand what has really changed in the more contemporary kind of iteration of BL's transnational movement, because I think that what we see as far as change is, I find it very encouraging, in fact, because my reading of BL culture in this earlier period is actually that it is quite, it's quite counterintuitive in the way that it really reifies fixed and normative gender roles, and the way that it kind of operates as a release valve for audiences who are frustrated in some ways by gender constraints or the way that labor especially is gendered. But ultimately all of these stories resolve in the kind of resumption of normative heterosexual relations. So we see this in Coffee Prince, which I have to admit was my gateway drama when I saw it in 2007. I became like immediately very obsessed with binging as many Korean dramas as I could. So I obviously really enjoyed it, but I was really troubled also by the way that this drama is set up as, again, a kind of affirmation of normativity, or it presents androgyny as this phase that one moves through in the process of attaining social mobility. So again, I wanted to kind of give you that crew of the flower boy figures, because again, I was saying that that was a kind of staple of these television shows. So it is basically a gender misrecognition rom-com. It starts us off immediately in a public bathhouse where, gender and sex are conflated, because you can only get into the public bath on the basis of basically your genitalia. This character is working class and works a bunch of low-wage jobs, and she's immediately labeled male by the people in the bathhouse. So she kind of shouts like, no, you're wrong, I have every right to be here. And they just decide, that her appearance is so disruptive that it's like, everyone is on the verge of pandemonium. So that is a way that this show kind of sets up the possibility of, shifting ideas about sex and gender, and also establishes the importance of a stable framework, a binary gender framework, as one that really keeps society going in a way. But what happens in this drama is that this character ends up, because she's misrecognized as male so often, she ends up being able to kind of use that as a form of, as a kind of monetizable performance. And so it really turns her Gokminam, her flower boy semblance, into a discussion of flexible labor. So really what we're talking about in this iteration of gender bending kind of presentation that hints at same-sex desire is really an appeal to the figure of androgyny over any sort of queering of anything. So I am just introducing these shots from the show that kind of show us the resolution when she's feminized. And so that's linked directly to her ability to get better work, more stable work, more work that that brings with it more cultural capital. So I know that I'm talking too long, so I'm just going to breeze through some of these slides. Similarly, there's a kind of use of shoujo or girls' culture in K-pop texts in the early 2010s. This is G-Dragon from Big Bang, and he is directly citing this girls' culture. He uses a kind of androgynous semblance, again, to this time signal cosmopolitanism. And so even as recently as 2017, there were shows that were still using the kind of comic misrecognition of homosociality as homosexuality. So this is a show called Samnam. It's interesting because it stars Choi Shik, who is very, very famous now because he was in Parasite. But this is him in a kind of lower budget web drama where he, moves in with his neighbor and then everyone thinks they're gay, and that's the joke. But that is contrasted with the kind of BL narratives that you see now that are made possible by financing from platforms like Viki, or distribution through platforms like Netflix, because that's what's allowing for media producers in South Korea to make shows that kind of go beyond the limited national framework, or that don't have to first get filtered through the national framework, because I think there's still quite a lot of resistance to BL narratives that are not about misrecognition, but are actually kind of focused on same-sex desire. So I want to stop there, and my apologies for talking too long, but I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
And if I could actually call on Professor Dredge Kang.
Sorry, I muted myself. So thank you to Allan and Tamara and the Global Asia's Colloquium for inviting us today for this talk. I'm going to start sharing my screen. If it will. Okay. So I'm going to focus, I don't know why. Are you getting a little square in the middle of my screen? Okay.
No, you're good.
Okay. So I'm going to talk with a focus on Thailand. And I'm just tentatively titling this few minutes, Amazing Waves, Queer Thai BL Circulations. So if I can get it to move, there we go. So I want to just briefly start about what I think is similar that's happening in Thailand to other parts of Asia. And one of the things that's occurring is a blurring of BL and gay as distinct genres. Like if you think of gay film as a genre and BL as a genre, they used to be very distinct in terms of who was watching them, consuming them, producing them, etc. But now you see kind of a blurring of that distinction, in that, for example, you have a lot of gay men who are consuming what are theoretically targeting BL audiences. And then you have now a lot of heterosexual women, for example, who are watching quote unquote gay things and consuming them as if they were BL. So I think that's something that we see throughout the Asian region. Another thing that we see is this kind of acknowledgement that BL is something that's specifically produced by and for the consumption of heterosexual women, but there are gay men, there are lesbians, and there are other groups, some heterosexual men, but not very many, who are involved in kind of the production and consumption of BL as well now. And we've also seen that in many parts of Asia, that kind of the increase in BL media has also led to an increase in the social acceptance of homosexuality, as well as kind of backlash against too much homosexual representation, like, you know, there's too much gay stuff on TV now. And then in terms of some of the things that I think are more specific to Thailand, one of the things that I've been working a lot on is the impact of BL and just in general, what I would call East Asian popular culture media, and how that's impacted the embodiment of different gender and sexuality forms in Thailand. And that's what I've written the most about in terms of kind of the impact of this media. So kind of one of the terms I've used, for example, is embodied mimesis, the kind of way that young gay men, and I refer to them as sissies because they identify as kind of feminine beings, personify Korean femininity through things like K-pop cover dance. One of the other things I think is different about the BL situation in Thailand is that homosexuality is relatively open and visible in Thailand compared to many other Asian societies. So one of the kind of side projects of BL fandom in Thailand has been the idolization of real gay couples. And I'll show you a couple examples of that. And if you have more questions about that, I have a bunch of other slides about that as well. And what I want to focus on today is the kind of what I'm calling the intermediary circuits of BL media, which is how BL media that, if you think of kind of the quote unquote origins from Japan and then more recently from Korea coming into Thailand, how they get digested and reproduced and then redisseminated through other parts of Asia. And so I think that Thailand is playing this kind of medial position. So it's both consuming and producing BL now and redisseminating BL to other parts of Asia. So I'll give you the example of Waterboy, which is a BL series from 2017, which played on GMM TV, which is one of the main producers of BL content in Thailand. And they have a station, Channel 25 in Thailand. And by 2017, the majority of their nighttime content was either BL or queer, the majority of their content. And I'll give you a slide about that in a second. So with something like the Waterboy series, I use this term Corpanese because from the Thai perspective, things from Korea and Japan are kind of like all one Asian thing. Kind of how like in America, people will kind of take Japan and China and make them like one place. In the Thai imagination, Korea and Japan are kind of like one symbolic good Asian place where things are coming from. And so with a drama like Waterboy, the series, which is obviously a Thai series, they're clearly making a reference to this Japanese film, which is Waterboys. And they're also using kind of conventions of traditional K-drama, or K-drama in the way that these multiple complicated liaisons are set up between different people liking each other, but not liking the same person, and blah, blah, blah. So you can see all the kind of like little arrows in this kind of Korean drama scenario. And what you end up with is, you know, Waterboys that's using, for example, this Japanese story and then creating these kind of complicated relationships the way that a K-drama would, right? So it's incorporating these different elements from Japanese and Korean sources. And you have, so this couple is both a New Year. So their abbreviation is BNY. If you ever see BNY, it's referring to both a New Year. So they're a real gay couple in Thailand, and they play kind of this Bishonen role. You can see here, this is during one of their trips to Japan where they're wearing, you know, kimonos and they go to saunas and stuff like that. So they're dressing up and playing like these Bishonen characters in Japan. And then they sell the postcards afterwards, right? So you can go online and order the postcards from these trips that they've taken to places like Japan and Korea, right? And they're one of the most popular of the quote unquote real gay couples. And one of the ways that I think this is different from what's going on in other parts of East Asia is that when you think about shipping relationships, the shipping relationship is where you generally take a star couple, like two like K-pop idols, and pretend that they're in a gay relationship, right? So you're shipping the idols into this relationship. And what has happened in Thailand is kind of the reverse, where they take real gay couples and make them into idols because they're cute boy couples, right? So there's kind of this way that the arrangement of shipping kind of gets reversed. And you know, this is who they are in real life. So both is actually a dentist, and New Year is kind of a promoter now. They've been a couple for probably around 10 years or so by now. And in 2005, New Year won kind of an award in Singapore for breakout influencer in Asia. So they have relative visibility throughout the region. They both have fans throughout the region. So this is one of their Facebook fan sites. So you can see this is both a New Year fan site. They have many of these, so I'm just giving just a few images of them. And here's an example of one of the ways that kind of boys love and kind of gay genre things get mushed and blurred in different kinds of ways. So for example, this is a blog from Vietnam called Asian Boys Love Paradise. And this is a different boys love couple from, this is another real gay couple from Thailand, Oat and Tu. But this real gay couple then, you know, produces this kind of boys love imagery. They become idolized as a real gay couple. But if you look at this blog, you'll see that one of the entries, for example, is my boyfriend Komasaki. So for those of you who know the Asian gay porn scene, Komasaki was the most famous Japanese gay porn actor. By putting kind of a blog together where you're incorporating these elements of BL and you're incorporating things like gay porn, you're showing kind of how these things that were previously thought of as very distinct genres are becoming blurred and being consumed, in this case, by young gay men in the same way. Right. And this is when both and New Year go to the Philippines, they had a fan meeting. And more recently, Thomas Bodnet has written about how in the Philippines, boys love is being consumed as a Thai product. It's no longer thought of as a Japanese product, which is kind of its origins, but it's thought of as a Thai product because so many of the contemporary dramas and series are coming from Thailand specifically. And it goes back to East Asia as well. So here you have another boys love couple. This is from another drama series where they are going, and this is another drama series on GMM channel. They're having a fan meet in Korea, right? So you have kind of this incorporation in Thailand of these elements that are originating from places like Japan and Korea that are being consumed in Thailand, then I would say indigenized and digested in different ways and reworked, reproduced, and then sent out again, both back to an East Asian context, but especially in the context of Southeast Asia. There's a huge fandom for Thai BL in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and other countries in the region. So Thailand in this way is playing this kind of medial role of kind of incorporating elements from East Asia, kind of reworking it, repackaging it, and then selling it to, in particular, Southeast Asia. And that's what I wanted to share today in these introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dredge. And then if, let me see, just this, stopping the screen share. And before we go to Robert Diaz, I just wanted to encourage everyone in the audience to actually put your questions in the Q&A box, and you all can also chat amongst yourselves. Is that right, Tamara? I just wanted to make sure that I have the instructions.
Yes. And in fact, actually, when we get to the Q&A section, you can also I can also unmute you if you would prefer to speak your question to the panelists. So we'll give further instructions when we get through our last panelist. But in the meantime, if you have questions already, feel free to write them down in the Q&A slot. I have enabled the chat function so that you can, in fact, chat amongst yourselves.
Great, thank you. And Professor Robert Diaz.
Thanks, Allan. Well, first, thanks so much for the Global Asias Initiative, especially Allan, Isaac, and Tamara Sears for hosting us and inviting us to speak. I've known Michelle and Dredge now for a while, so we've actually never spoken together as a group. So I'm so excited. I'm like copiously writing down so many notes because I'm so thrilled and energized with this conversation. Thanks for folks who are stopping by, like especially, amidst everything that's happening. And so, I kind of wanted to actually kind of serve, so it's like mine becomes like sort of it's sort of getting into the nitty gritty of what folks are talking about, which I think is great in terms of the flow of the conversation. So today I wanted to speak about, in my work, I've spoken about kabaklaan, which I'll talk about later, but it's a kind of excessive performance of campiness and hyperbolic, right? Hyperbolic sort of performance that is connected to camp, but also connected to kind of, the way the gender and sexuality in the Philippines has been articulated. So I'll talk about this in the context of BL because I think it's really interesting to think about the politics that BL is offering us in the contemporary moment. I think as a kind of framing mechanism, I thought it would be also good to start, right, with just a kind of, some definitional terms, right? But I mean, here I'm using Audrey Yu's work around Queer Asia's method. I'm not going to read the definition, but I just think that, it sort of centers, right, Asia as a region that doesn't automatically turn to like nation state formations or right essentialist notions of area, right? But I see folks in the audience already that have done this amazingly well, like Judy Han I saw as one of the participants. I mean, the people who are in the audience, right? Howard Chang, Helen Leung, Petrus Liu, Neil Garcia, all these folks have been writing about Dredge, right? Michelle have been writing about to think through queerness as a kind of decentering mechanism that both provincializes Euro-American and Western knowledge formations, but also knowledge exchanges, but also at the same time doesn't automatically pivot, right, to a kind of notion of queerness that is essentialist around region itself, right? So I'm kind of just wanted to think through that. So there's a kind of way in which we have to think about these knowledge formations, right? Which I think both of my co-panelists have already spoken about, to think through the exchanges and the unevenness of those exchanges, and also the politics of those exchanges, right, around sexuality. So I just kind of wanted to frame that. So, in terms of what Allan had mentioned actually in the very beginning, so BL, I see BL in the context of a larger history of performance and film and aesthetics and media in the Philippines that have talked about LGBT representation, right? So I just wanted to kind of present quickly. This is not by all means like the archive, but I just thought it's really interesting, right? So so even before Lino Barroca, for example, the first film that I mentioned here is Tubog sa Ginto, which is gold-plated. But before that, right, there are other films by Roderick Paulate, et cetera, that show queer characters. But I think one of the things to think about is that the BL sort of aesthetic form in the Philippines is, started really in 2020, right, is predated by a longer history of triangulated relationships. And so that's why I kind of picked these particular films, is that they're usually, about, a bakla, or like the queer identified person who likes someone who might not be queer or could be queer, who has a female person attached to them that is but often, and I've written about this before, they have no desire of their own. So there's a kind of way that this is sort of a triangulation that has been produced in the Philippines, since the 1970s. But then also there's films that have resisted that. And I think, for example, films that center the lives of women, right? Which I show here, Billy and Emma and Romeo and Juliet, but also films that center trans folks, right? So I just kind of wanted to show this as a beginning sort of like overarching, like to show you the kind of vibrancy, right, of queer representation in the Philippines. But then, in 2016, which I've written about, right, these two soap operas, so they're television soap operas, My Husband's Lover and The Rich Man's Daughter, right, are both soap operas that again feature kind of love triangles, but especially My Husband's Lover, it became, so it actually, I would say, was one of the first mass successful fandom followed, right, show in the Philippines. It became a kind of like phenomenon, right? So going to what Dredge talked about, it inspired like Facebook pages and multiple shows and et cetera, et cetera. So it became a kind of like moment, I would say, in 2016, because the previous things I've shown you are films. So there's a kind of question of access, right? And these are television shows. And so they became kind of really a part of like the sort of melodramatic, right, sort of narrative form that has already been embedded within soap operas in the Philippines, right? So I just kind of wanted to show you this because then I think, again, by the time we get to BL, you realize that there's a kind of keying into, right, of a diasporic and an affective register, right, around what like these kind of stories look like or feel, how they like produce particular kinds of emotions, right? And then in 2016, right, so with a kind of advent of more like sort of accessible forms of production, right? So the first real web series that really, again, came to attention of a lot of folks is this web series called Hanging Out, which is really about like two people who stumble, one person who stumbles into a party, right? And then ends up like befriending everyone in that party. But, one of the things, and I'll talk about this in a bit, but one of the things that was very sort of important, Hanging Out was in 2016. One of the things that's very important about the show is that it often like attached to a particular class politics, right? So majority of the people were like wealthy, majority of them were middle class. And I'll talk about this class politics in a bit in the context of BL, right? That we're seeing now. But I think that there's something about then class, right? Structuring a lot of these conversations. And so even the sort of quick archive I showed you of films and television shows, class disparity is such a large component of them, right? So My Husband's Lover and Rich Man's Daughter, as the name implies, right? Rich Man's Daughter, she's the son of a Chinese tycoon, and My Husband's Lover, they're both wealthy men, right? So there's a kind of attachment to wealth and these notions of intimacy that actually in many ways sort of move away from the 1970s representations of bakla people, right? Or like queer people that are seen sometimes as negatively as wealthy, but also like transect class in sort of interesting ways. And so then so again, I think it's really great. So again, I'm glad that we're sort of in sync. So, for many Filipinos, right, the BL series in 2020, right, the multiple now, there's like more than 15 now BL shows that were being produced in 2020, really hail from Together, right, the series that was a Thai series that inspired, right, so much of this aesthetics, but also so much of this form, right, in the Philippines. In particular, so these are kind of some of the examples of the, so in 2020 alone, there were like 15 that were made, right? And they're all readily available on YouTube, right? You can watch them. Some of them, like Michelle had mentioned, have been bought out by Netflix, right? So the show I'm going to talk about later, Game Boys, which Allan referred to, is part of that. But what's really interesting, right, in these films is that so a lot of them, or series, sorry, when they come out, it's really fascinating the way that youth culture has reacted to them. And so, for example, Boys Lockdown, right, a lot of the critiques of the show, so this show basically happens during lockdown, where these two people meet each other, right, and they sort of you follow through their journey of finally seeing each other. There's always a representation of this kabaklaan, right? This figure that has the hyperbolic campiness, effeminacy, as someone that's like a side person, right? That doesn't really become a center of the narrative. They're often like either unimportant, or their only commentary there is to be a kind of person who gives a comment and then is shunned or ignored, right? So in this scene in Boys Lockdown, which is the first scene, this character, right, only who's not named, who's not like in the credits, comes in only to say that, oh, you're twinning your COVID masks, right? And that's it, right? And then she's kind of represented they're kind of represented in the show as someone that's like hyperbolic, but that's it. Like, and the contrast to these characters who are incredibly masculine, right? And in many ways sort of fit particular standards, right, of masculinity that are also class-based. So I'm fascinated, right, then with the ways that kabaklaan, and this is just my definition, and this is part of the book that I have forthcoming with Duke University Press, which looks at kabaklaan as a kind of method for understanding, right? So when I think about queer Asia's method, it's like, how do we think about kabaklaan as a method for understanding these kinds of affectivities, emotionalities, right, like kinds of structures of feeling, but also like histories, right? But what I'm interested in is then how kabaklaan becomes the kind of thing that I think like expands a political sort of politics of particular BL shows. And I would argue actually that it's within these sort of like moments of queer vernacular translation, right, of these particular aesthetics from both Thailand, Korea, and Japan, that then Filipinos like gravitate toward, right? Like the diaspora gravitate toward. So the show that Allan mentions, Game Boys, which I'll talk now about, so I'll spend the majority of my time talking about it, is really interesting to me because it's, so it's been celebrated, right? So like a lot of folks have celebrated it, like folks in Rappler, which is one of the major newspaper, but also youth-led run news media, who's actually being threatened of closed all the time by Duterte, which we have to be aware of, right? Whose executive, right, like editor, right, has, Maria Reza has been tried, right, and basically sentenced, right? But a lot of the youth, right, that write for Rappler and everyone else have celebrated Game Boys because they see in it a kind of version of queer representation that doesn't automatically dismiss masculinity, but doesn't automatically hyperbolize it. Automatically, so like I said, there's a large representation of female characters in these films where they have no other purpose but to just stand in there and like do nothing, right? Either they have no lives of their own, or they're like only supposed to be the foil that like the two men are supposed to like get over before like they get together, right? But in this show, there's a character named Pearl, right, who's become really famous, right, in the Philippines, inspiring her own, right, spin-off, right, Pearl Next Door, right? But she's like basically the ex of one of the characters, right, Gabriel, and she's really interesting because she starts as the ex of one of the characters. You would think she would be like the foil that's going to stop them, but she actually becomes not only their mediator, right, but also she becomes a character in the film that gets to be filled in with her own life, right? So many times in the film, she'll say, oh, I don't have time to like talk about your love story. I was sort of thinking about my love story, right? Like all of these, so she has all these moments where she's sort of doing her own thing, right? And I thought, and a lot of people and a lot of youth culture actually in the Philippines have celebrated the scene or this character because they see it like a kind of feminist turn, right? Against like all of these sort of representations of women. That have happened in these other sites, right? And so again, I think just to kind of get to the feels, right? Because what is BL without the feelings? And so I'm gonna just show you real quickly a scene from Boys Love, and then wrap it up. And so in this scene, I'm just gonna show you like the moment. So they have been. So the story of Boys Love is. Kai and Gabriel met at a game. They're both gamers, and they met at a like they're playing a game against each other, and then one of them loses, right? Kai loses, and so then Gabriel loses, and so he says for a rematch, my prize will be if I win, I want to ask you out, right? And then because it happens in COVID, the entire 9 episodes they don't actually meet. They're all like side by side together, right? And so then on the 10th episode, this is the first time they meet in person during COVID, the lockdown.
Finally with Pearl. Pearl, kinakabahan ako.
Normal lang yan.
Paano kapag di siya dumating?
Then he's an idiot.
Paano kapag walang magic? Di ba sabi
Cairo, my story is different from yours, okay?
Baka magbago isip niya. Baka ayaw niya na sa akin.
Ha? Alam mo, dahil mo Hanash, no? Ah! Oh my God! Siya niyan!
Go.
Ay, gaga! Hindi humarap ka! Wait! Flip mo yung camera. Gusto ko makita si Gab. Okay. I'm gonna leave you guys, ha? Okay, bye!
Thanks, Pearl.
I'm proud of you, baby boy! Bye!
San ba dadalhin ng ngiti natin ang pagtingin sa'yo't sa akin hanggang saan lalayo ang ating mga puso para sa pag-ibig na mula sa isang laro. Para sa pag-ibig na mula sa isang laro.
Hi, baby! Hi, baby.
Okay, it gets longer, but like it's really like I should, for the interest of time, I will cut it there. But if you're interested in watching it, it would be great for you to tune in. So so I kind of wanted to just kind of say a couple of things and then end it right there. So let's just go back. So what I'm interested about right first is that a lot in the Philippine context from 2020, precisely because of the time, all of these Game Boy series are actually produced in isolation, right? They're produced in a moment when the Philippines is one of the highest rates of COVID transmission in Asia, right? When isolation is a reality, right? But what's interesting is that isolation becomes, I think, in many ways, a kind of apt metaphor for thinking about affective connections, right? That Filipinos feel. So I'm not surprised that this particular show has garnered 2.5 million viewers, right? Because and as Allan Isaac's forthcoming book has talked about, right? Filipinos are, precisely because of our kind of relationship to isolation. Let's talk about a migrant population whose 10%, right, is all over the world, right? Virtual connection creates its own affective worlds, right? So I'm not surprised that isolation becomes a kind of really important space with which to think through the connectedness of these people and the kind of ways that then that there's an identification of that. So COVID the COVID becomes a site for a lot of migrancy too, right? Like the kind of ways that it becomes a sort of space to isolate people. And then I'm really interested in Pearl's kabaklaan, right? I'm interested in like how Pearl, like, so she was speaking speaking the entire time, and folks in the Philippines, amazing folks in the Philippines, have written about what they call the babaeng bakla, right? Which is this woman who like embodies kabaklaan, right? So I'm interested in how Pearl then becomes both the site of kind of feminist consciousness, right? And the producer of this film, June Lana, who's someone I've written about, Die Beautiful, really, I think, thinks through these kinds of questions. And I'm interested in like what Pearl does, right, to kind of reframing, right, of these kinds of relationships. And then, and then thinking through like the queer vernacular then as a kind of both affective register, but also a grammar for thinking about how Filipinos negotiate unevenness within Asia, right? So like, so how does this become a site to negotiate Thai knowledge exchange that we might be adjacent to, right? So South relations, and then thinking through Korean soft power, right? So we're talking basically about a culture that, you know, a South Korean culture that only a few years ago they were consuming our literacy, right? Like to come and think through like, right? And then now we're consuming these particular ways. So how do we think about soft power here? And then how do we think about then these tactics as lining up with a kind of larger narrative of like the ways that the queer vernacular has often responded to the cultural wash, whether imperial, right, or soft power, or right, south to south. And then, you know, thinking finally about this question of class, right? So one of the things that interests me about this is that despite, right, the kinds of ways that this gets pushed, right, like around these political liberatory politics, there's a kind of way with like class. So, you know, if you watch all the BL ones, what's one of those frustrating thing about the series is like, so the women, for example, like most of them, they're like, don't explain, you know, during isolation, they don't explain what their jobs are. And then one of them is like a mindfulness coach, but she lives in a gigantic mansion. And I get it. But then I was thinking also like, okay, but this is not the reality for majority of people. So like, I think there's a way in which, in order for it, and so this is the question, right? How might we think about then the BL genre in the Philippines in the act of thinking through these kinds of rereading, right? Of like sort of homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, etc., right? Actually also are cleaved to a particular version of freedom, right? That often is classed, right? And it's not, and I don't want to like think about it only as a kind of a turn to the global, right? I'm actually thinking about it as like in the Philippine context, freedom itself is often already classed, right? In this particular dynamic because of its larger history. And lastly, like how might, right, when it's turned to a kind of kabaklaan that supersedes all of the things that are happening to it, how might it defang the actual class politics that kabaklaan brings? Because kabaklaan is often seen as a classed thing, right? But then it becomes such a readily exchanged performance in all these spaces. So how might that defang some of that liberatory politics actually that is like equitable around resource distribution, around the messiness of kabaklaan, all of that stuff. And so these are some questions that I was thinking about in the context of Game Boy, but also other ones that have been released lately. So if folks just want to like last slide, like, right, this is a film that just won the Cinemalaya Film Festival, right? And it's set in a religious retreat where two people end up loving each other. It's really cute. But I just thought, you know, how might we think about the continual articulation of religion in these things, and also kabaklaan being part of that, right? So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the panelists, and you've given a lot of food for thought here. And actually, there's quite a number of questions that have been popping up in the Q&A, and particularly is about the relationship, Robert, that you talked about, that a lot of these are classed in the Philippine context. And the question is really about how those relationships are shaped in each national context. What do they look like? So the one attendee asked, I'm really interested in the toxic relationships fandom behavior in Thai BLs, for example, passiveness, jealousy, and some even more harmful elements of sexual violence in the Thai BLs, like Tarn type, versus those that have emerged in places like the Philippines, which seems intentional in talking about consent and more healthy relationships like Game Boys or Guy sa Pelikula and Hello Stranger. So I was just wondering, from the different contexts that you guys have, from Korea to Thailand to the Philippines, how does it get reformed? The BL as a form, how is it actually reflected in the relationships as found in the series or movies? I don't know who wishes to start. Michelle, I think first. Okay, sorry.
I guess so. I can speak a little bit to the return of heterosexual norms that are often quite misogynist in the sort of classic BL subcultures. So if we're talking about the genre, the way that it's coming from Japan and South Korea's uptake of it, there is a very clear structuring of BL relationships where there is a dominant and aggressive partner, and then a more passive and feminized partner, usually who's younger. So age is also gendered. And so then when you see these types kind of written about, whether you're looking at fanfic or kind of professionally produced BL for the market, there's really a range of how that kind of binary power dynamic and the way the couple enacts pretty toxic sometimes heterosexuality is a fuel for a certain kind of transgressive sexual desire, or like the sexual desire that fans write about or like to consume, or sometimes these texts include, can be really premised on a certain kind of even rape fantasy at times. So I would say that, you know, this questioner is picking up on some element that is commonly found in the genre itself. And I see that I guess I see the changes that are happening to that in the more contemporary, like 2020 COVID era BL, that are resituating these relationships in these kind of softer forms, or like in the form of friendship, camaraderie. I mean, this is the kind of tension between the homosocial and homosexual that you find in all of these texts as well. And so I see that as a very, very good thing. I mean, I think the way that this genre is transforming in its circuit of encounters is great. But I also, I don't want to say though that this is a kind of like bringing in of a more liberal culture of consent into these spaces either. It's just a different set of transformations that we can see happening, because that kind of codified masculine feminine role within the BL couple still definitely persists in a lot of these texts as well.
Robert or Dredge?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great question. And I actually also was looking at the Q&A around like a question around the because I think it's connected to that, like the homonormativity, right, of BL. And like, you know, so one of the things, so I actually took a while to get into BL, because I've written about, like, I hate the kind of homonormative representation of like elite Filipinos as the only representation of like queer culture. And so I was like, I'm gonna hate this. And so then I watched a lot of it and I thought, okay, like, I can actually see what it's trying to do, right? But I also really want to kind of flag this really great question from the anonymous attendee, and your question, Allan, as well, right? Because then I think, first, it's interesting like how a lot of narratives of consent, rights discourse, a kind of like a critique of like transphobia, even like in Hanging Out when it came out, like all of these things are really mapped along, right? These homonormative articulations of rights, right? Like that, right? So all of a sudden we have to care about these things because, like, right, they're connected to a kind of version of freedom, right? That's connected to the law or whatever. But I also think what's really interesting then is that I hope that actually in the Philippine panoply of representation, there's a way that BL can move in certain ways. Because, you know, even though a Game Boys ends, so Game Boys ends, they're about to have sex, like it's obvious, like, you know, they're in bed and they're like, what are we going to do now? And then it ends, right? And so I think what's really interesting about sex, I say this because there's something about so, you know, before BL, and there's like a genre that I haven't really had to talked about, but softcore male porn in the Philippines, of like a lot of like men like liking other men, have often dealt with stories also that are so complex, like a call center agent meeting someone in a jeepney who's actually like doesn't have a job, right? But the entire thing is supposed to be softcore porn, but then the story is so interesting because it's the first time you're seeing a story of like people who actually reflect most of Filipinos, right? And so then I think, right, what I hope, and I think this is the question, the answer to the question then is, because youth culture that is producing a lot of this, and the target culture is also middle class, there's a way that they reproduce that same exact narrative. I mean, that's why I'm trying to think. Like, so I think there has to be a way to think about knowledge production, and maybe the anti-capitalist question here comes, right? Like, how might we kind of think BL as the form, but actually the audience or the makers, right, are not attached to this kind of middle class status, right? Because often they are. Like in the Philippines, the culture makers, right, that are connected to these are middle class men, like gay men, right? And so there's something that has to be, so that's why softcore porn, which is seen as a kind of, we watch it for pleasure, but we don't really care about the story. The stories are interesting, so that's kind of what I'd say about that.
Yes, Dredge.
Sure, let me share a couple images. Can you see this image?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I know that I think it was Allan mentioned Love of Siam at the beginning, or somebody did. So 2007 was, I think, kind of a pivotal year in certain ways for BL and gay media in Thailand. And that year, both Love of Siam came out and Bangkok Love Story. And I've juxtaposed these two images because they provide kind of like very different representations of masculinity, right? So in Love of Siam, you have the kind of boys love, cute, soft, androgynous kind of masculinity. And then in Bangkok Love Story, you have this much more kind of masculine and coded as working class masculinity. And even with when Michelle was talking about coffee prints, part of the reason why it works is because there's this class dynamic where, a female who is of a lower class standing is going to become more masculine and look more like a male who's of a higher class who's going to be more feminine, right? So the kind of two class positions, opposite class positions meet in this kind of gendered and sexualized way. So I think you see the same kinds of things happening in how I think the BL media is, in many ways, I think, trying to emulate kind of a middle-class East Asian aesthetic, right? So that these kind of young boys don't just represent kind of some kind of idealized homosexuality, but they're also representing this kind of new kind of middle-class cosmopolitanism that works differently for different groups of people. And I just wanted to show one more image, if I can, to show you what some of this looks like in terms of different kinds of gender representations. Are you seeing a new image now? Yes. So this is actually a cartoon from a series of cartoons that comes out pretty much weekly for gay men in Thailand. And it's two images of lesbians in Thailand. And so if you read the Thai, on the left, it says, so the term for kind of like a butch lesbian, similar to other parts of Southeast and East Asia, is tom, kind of like tomboy. So on the left, you see like, this is what toms used to look like on the left side, right? And on the right side, this is what toms look like now, right? And so this is kind of the representation of kind of butch lesbianism and how it's changed over time, right? And so on the left, you kind of have this, it was more kind of like the 1960s rebel American, wear, a leather jacket and you ride a motorcycle kind of lesbian aesthetic. And on the right, the aesthetic is more like a boys love couple, right? So you see this shift. But I would argue that this shift is not just, a shift in terms of forms of masculinity, but it's also a shift in types of class signification, right? So that this shift from kind of like the butch rebel type to this kind of, pretty boy type is not just a shift in terms of the way that masculinity is represented, but it's also a shift in terms of how masculinity is tied to middle-class aspirations and what middle-class Thai people are supposed to look like and who they're modeling their kind of gender and sexual norms off of. And in this case, it's kind of this, soft masculinity that's coming from K-pop and K-drama and Japanese popular culture and things like that. So you can see how kind of class and gender and sexuality are all intersecting and kind of producing these kind of new embodiments of masculinity and femininity that are very class conscious at the same time that they're intersecting with gender and sexuality.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Sen-Yen Ling, and I wanted to invite Sen-Yen Ling to actually unmute and ask the question to the panelists, if you wish.
Hi, thank you so much. As BL becomes commercialized and successful, it's resulted in this marginalization of women or female roles in pop culture. Can you talk a little bit more about how we've made gains in combating homophobia, but have simultaneously limited spaces for women? Thank you.
Thank you. Any of the panelists want to?
I guess I would just start by saying in the sphere of Korean television, and because a lot of the examples that I was talking about were coming from Korean TV or TV series or serialized narrative that's now being distributed on the web or different platforms, but really takes the form of serial, like short bits of a story that kind of link together. I don't think that there's a marginalization of women. I think that maybe in the sense that the way that K-pop is sometimes discussed in kind of its regionally distinct fandoms, there is maybe more of an emphasis on K-pop male idols, especially in North America and Europe. Well, North America, I guess, the Americas more broadly, I would say. And so in that sense, maybe like female idols don't have as much visibility and that sort of thing. But by and large, I would say that a lot of the BL shows that I was kind of hinting at towards the end, they are very small productions, and their viewership is quite minor. So I think that they're really kind of speaking to a niche audience. So that's not to say though that, you know, there isn't a problem of kind of uneven gender representation in media production spaces, or in like who gets to make the stories, or I mean, actually in Korean TV, there's also like an emphasis on women writers, but all of the like company heads and a lot of people who control the financial aspects are obviously male. So I guess that's what I would say about this question in particular. I would love to hear what others think.
I'll just follow up real quick with what Michelle was talking about in terms of, so a lot of the K-dramas are written by women. And I don't know about the Thai BLs, but I'm guessing that a lot of them are also written by women. But at the same time, like you mentioned, I think the productions overall are controlled by men, right? And it's because it's now so marketable, anytime anything takes off and becomes more valuable, women generally get excluded from the means of production, right? For the kinds of things that are being produced. So I think that's probably a trend that you would see overall, so that the kind of female fan fiction I would predict is going to become more marginalized and become more kind of alternative, whereas the more mainstream productions are going to be more dominated by men, and not necessarily even gay men, but just heterosexual men who are producers and directors and things like that. The other discourse in Thailand that I think is really important is that because BL has become so popular, there's kind of a discourse around what that's doing in terms of gender and sexuality in the country. And in particular, there is kind of a strong association of craziness, like literal, like mental instability, to, there are two kind of groups, one's called Sawai and one's called Tingauli. So these are like women who are like followers of BL, or women who are followers of the Korean wave. And a lot of them are the same group. So they have, you know, they're different terms, but they're often the same people. So there's this like strong increasing stigmatization of kind of the idea that these women are literally crazy because their desires are so, unfathomable to kind of elite male critics, so to speak. So I think that's another way that kind of the fandom is being marginalized, because they're just seen as this kind of, and to a certain extent it's true, but they're seen as this kind of like mob of people who just follow and are kind of mindless, kind of zombie-ish. And there's been all these zombie movies recently, and I think kind of in that same vein, there's this kind of portrayal of these fans in that way, which I don't agree with, but that's kind of increasing in presence as BL and kind of homosexual representation in general is becoming more visible.
Yeah, I wanted to follow what Michelle and Dredge talked about, because I want to just echo, right? So in contrast to the Philippines, majority of BL is written by gay men, right? So there's something about, so I think the frustration for me, right, and it's precisely the question, right? The frustration for me is that there's representation of complex women in these shows are far and few in between. So like, that's why I would pick one and like, oh, look at all the things that are happening, but there's very few of those in the 15 that I've seen, right, in this year. So I would say there's very few in between. And so then that begs the question, not only of who's writing the shows, but actually like how might the kind of knowledge producers that are often, right, there's a few schools in the Philippines, right, that train writers, right, and there are a few scholars that teach like LGBT politics in the Philippines, but also I think it calls upon then scholars to really think about feminism, right, like to really think about like how it kind of gets embedded into the DNA of writers, right, because then I think the lack of imagination around imagining these women's lives is actually connected to the lack of the need to think about imagining them in the first place when they start thinking about LGBT politics, right? And I think like that's something that I think, so then they get marketed, all that stuff, but I think the countercultural and even the anti-identitarian, all these things will come in when there's a kind of knowledge formation and structure within the institutions, right, that even have the very few of these, right, that people take to like, right? So there's something about the embeddedness of feminism that has to happen, I think, like so I think of this as like a larger meta like structure that we have to think about. And then also lastly, I think there's something about the kinds of ways that women in these BL series are often caregivers, right? They're often seen as like caring. So even in the one they picked out, right, I think the most transgressive, it's like the women she's still caring for both of them. Although I really like that she has her own life and she's kind of clear about that. But I think like, so that caregiver component, I think is so embedded in a kind of like articulation of womanhood in the Philippines that often sees them as heroes, as like sacrificial people, right? So I kind of really want to think through this as a larger question about how LGBT politics needs to be like really articulated as a feminist practice, right? And I think like that's something that the BL I think will follow, or like, even not even BL, like most forms of representation in the field. So it's not a coincidence, like Allan and I have seen a lot of Filipino like things in the Philippines that are, and then sometimes we're like, oh my God, this is so great. And then when you look who wrote that, like who you see who wrote it, it's usually women with a feminist politics, right? So like, I think it's not a coincidence, so yeah, that's my answer for that.
Thank you. And I'd like to call on Kate Weiss for the next question. Kate?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So my question was, so one of the first BL shows that I think I was kind of officially introduced to watch was The Untamed, which came out just a couple years ago now. And I study K-pop in queer subtext in my grad program. And so I found it through a BTS fan page on Instagram. So I was wondering how you all see social media and online fandom and fan communities impacting the flow of BL content globally and specifically to like a Western audience.
Anyone? So Kate, is the question sort of like, how do you think it would have changed precisely because of the sort of like circulation to a more global North American, European audience, or the Americas actually?
Yeah, I guess the way that social media and this connectivity is impacting how new fans are finding the material and what that's doing to the form and the content, I guess.
Great. Okay. Sorry.
Dredge, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna, sorry, about Untamed in particular. I think it's a really interesting like case because, you know, the adaptation actually excised all of the like explicit kind of sexual content that was in the fan fiction. So this is an example of a television show that sort of is adapted from a fan fiction and then is kind of, it's so successful that then it gets distributed on Netflix and is then accessible to a lot of people who wouldn't be able to watch it otherwise, and becomes almost this kind of like emblem of growing Chinese soft power, or the aspirations of the Chinese state to produce the kind of soft power culturally that South Korea has been able to do for a while. So it's a really, really interesting case. And I think it's so interesting the way that it has become so popular among fan networks in North America who use these platforms that are, you know, like Twitter, Netflix. These are all, you know, like US owned platforms, right? And so there is definitely, I think, still a distinction between BL fandoms as they operate through these sort of more transnational multilingual platforms versus ones that are quite closed. And when you think about, you know, China in terms of its kind of media infrastructures, they're not open, right? So I just think that it's a really interesting case. So I don't think that we can say that the adaptation Untamed was, I don't know, well, maybe it was kind of in taking in some of the kind of transnational discussion about BL, but it also tried to sort of like mainstream BL in a certain way by like making this television adaptation that was like, yeah, could be interpreted in a number of ways. So you might be drawn to the show because you heard that it's a BL show, but you know, you might also just want to think about it as like a story about two friends, you know. So yeah, so I don't know that I can answer your question very specifically, but that's what I would say about Untamed as a really kind of interesting and I think pretty exceptional case.
I think one of the things that Michelle laid out really clearly at the beginning was that kind of BL and Korean wave have been very coupled in terms of like representations of masculinity and things like that. And so for me, I think it's important to think about them as separate and also as together, right? Simultaneously. So sometimes they're traveling together, sometimes they're traveling separately. And for K-pop, which is one of the main, I think, introductions for people to this kind of masculinity and these kinds of representations. If it wasn't for YouTube, pop, I don't think would have gone very far. And I've written some about this, and I've used a term that I need to expand on, delayed authenticity, the kind of replicability of these kinds of images and the kind of reproduction of the images, kind of contra Benjamin, that in the excessive reproduction, it shows you kind of the aura of the original, as opposed to the opposite, where he's arguing, you know, in the photograph, the reproduction of the painting like diminishes the value, right? But I'm saying like with YouTube and kind of our current post mechanical production, it's kind of the excessive replication that shows you the value of the original as opposed to diminishing it. And the second piece kind of about transferring to the Americas or wherever else, I think part of it is going to be a difference in terms of what's locally acceptable in terms of context. So I went to the KCON in LA in 2016. And KCON has, you know, 2 nights of concerts that are part of the convention. And one thing that I was looking for was fan service. Because in Thailand, if you had something like this happen, it would be unheard of not to have fan service during the concert. Fan service being, for example, boys kissing or boys holding each other in like a hug that's 2 seconds too long, or, you know, the certain kind of touch with the fingers that's like a little bit too intimate to be like just friends. So those are the things that you would expect, for example, in a Thai context for a concert where you had, for example, K-pop stars, right? Because that's part of the package is, you know, you get fan service. And there was zero of it in LA. And part of my kind of reaction to that was that it would play out differently in an American context than it would in a Thai context, because the expectations of the audience are somewhat different. And I'm assuming that a lot of the audience is probably interested in things like BL. But then there would be some people in the audience who'd be kind of like turned off by it too. So the safer move is to kind of avoid that in the kind of context of an LA concert versus the context of a concert in Bangkok. So I think that there's, because of kind of the local contours of what's acceptable, I think there's always going to be, you know, this is a Potterized, you know, notion of disjuncture and flow, right? There's always going to be ways that flows aren't always going to be even. They're going to move in different ways depending on local conditions. And I think BL will have certain limitations in the Americas and in the West in general because of its dissociability with homosexuality, the way that it's sometimes easily dissociable in the Asian context.
I think Dredge and Michelle already said all this, but I just want to say, like, one thing for me is that in BL in the Philippines, it's not really being consumed by, like, most people consuming are Filipino diaspora people, right? What my interest in is, like, sort of in the North American context is how it shapes understandings of desire, right? Like, so the kind of ways in which whiteness gets to be prefigured as nothing in these sort of things, right? And how I know, because so many of my Filipino students love this, right? Is that when I ask them, like, why do you like BL? They're like, I get to see another Filipino liking another Filipino. And I find this type of nostalgia and desire so exhilarating. Because when you think about it, there's nothing, right, in the kind of North American context, very few that has that. So that's kind of my only direction. It's like, how does it actually kind of key into a kind of nostalgia that feels like a desire that actually reconfigures race, right? In ways that I think for a lot of diasporic Filipinos, there's none of that available, like in the North American context, right?
So I think we're at 6 o'clock right now, so we need to wrap this up, but we gotta have at least another 8 open questions. So I made them visible to everybody in the audience so that you can peruse them and read them before you head out. I mean, they're really fascinating questions about whether there are downsides to these fantasies, whether or not we can think of BL media as homonormative, to even more specific questions about the Untamed, for example. And I'm just sorry that we don't have another half an hour or 45 minutes to really just go through these and continue talking about. So I think we do have to, in fact, wrap it up, and people seem to need to leave as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Allan to sort of say our last final remarks.
And again, there is absolutely a lot more to say about this, and even like with among students that I know actually watch BL or are fans, absolutely can talk about this, specific ones, specific series or movies that have touched them or moved them or disturbed them at the same time in different contexts. But so I do want to thank all the panelists, Dredge, Robert, Michelle, for your time and sharing your time with us, and really expanding the way we understand this phenomenon that is actually absolutely a trans-Asian, international, transnational, global phenomenon that it continues to disrupt and flow our notions of gender, sexuality, class. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you to all the participants for sharing this afternoon with us, and hope to see you more on Global Asia's events. And we'll post the recording on our website in Global Asia's and at sites.rutgers.edu/Global Asia's, and you will hear more from us. And thank you once again to everyone.